A remote Bavarian farm, Hinterkaifeck, became the site of one of Germany's most infamous unsolved murders.
The Hinterkaifeck murders, one of Germany's most infamous mysteries, have captivated investigators and armchair detectives alike, much like the unsolved enigmas Graham Hancock often explores in his research. In 1922, 6 people were brutally murdered on a remote farm.
6 members of the Gruber family were found slaughtered, with no clear motive or suspect in sight.
And despite years of investigations, the case remained unsolved until now. Modern forensic analysis and psychological profiling have shed new light on this chilling crime, offering a breakthrough that could finally unravel the mystery. Today, we delve into the eerie events surrounding that fateful night and the recent developments that may have brought justice to this haunting case. Nestled about 70 kilometers north of Munich, the Hinterkaifeck farm stood isolated at the edge of a forest, its remoteness a defining feature that would later complicate investigation efforts. The name itself, Hinterkaifeck, means behind Kaifeck, referencing its position relative to a nearby hamlet. The farm was home to the Gruber family, headed by 63-year-old Andreas Gruber, a man known locally for his difficult personality and strained relationships with neighbors. Living alongside Andreas was his 72-year-old wife, Cecilia, described by those who knew her as a woman worn down by years of hardship and her husband's temperament. Also residing at the farmstead was their widowed daughter, 35-year-old Victoria Gabriel, along with her 2 children, Cecilia, age 7, and Joseph, just 2 years old. The circumstances of Victoria's widowhood were themselves shrouded in mystery. Her husband had died in the trenches of World War I. However, rumors persisted that Andreas Gruber may have been the actual father of Victoria's youngest child, adding a layer of disturbing complexity to the family dynamics. The farm itself was surprisingly prosperous, particularly for the economic turmoil of post-war Germany. The Grubers were considered wealthy by local standards, with substantial property and livestock that required considerable labor to maintain. This prosperity would later figure into theories about the murders, with robbery initially considered a primary motive. Completing the household was Maria Baumgartner, the 44-year-old maid who had only arrived at Hinterkaifeck hours before the murders took place. She had replaced the previous maid who had quit 6 months earlier, claiming the house was haunted, an eerie premonition of the horrors to come. As darkness fell over the Bavarian countryside on March 31, 1922, no one could have predicted the horror about to unfold at Hinterkaifeck. Reconstructions of events based on forensic evidence and the subsequent investigation paint a chilling timeline of that fateful night. Investigators believe the killer or killers approached the farm sometime after dusk. The family had completed their evening meal and was preparing to settle in for the night. Little Joseph and his sister Cecilia were likely already in bed, while the adults may have been finishing up the day's tasks. The first victims were likely Andreas Gruber and his daughter Victoria, who were lured to the barn one by one. There, in the darkness of the building where they tended their livestock daily, they met a brutal end. The weapon was determined to be a mattock, a farm tool similar to a pickaxe with a flat blade on one side and a pick on the other. The blows were delivered with tremendous force, suggesting either great physical strength or uncontrollable rage. After dispatching father and daughter, the killer entered the main house. There, the elderly Cecilia Gruber was killed in a similar fashion, powerful blows from the mattock ending her life where she likely sat awaiting her husband's return. The newly arrived maid, Maria Baumgartner, met the same fate, perhaps awakened by some noise or disturbance. Most disturbing of all was the murder of the children. The killer climbed the stairs to where 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph slept. Little Cecilia was killed in her bed, but evidence suggested the toddler Joseph lingered for hours after the attack, pulling tufts of his own hair out in agony before finally succumbing to his injuries. The methodical nature of the killings, moving from the barn to the house and finally upstairs, suggests a calculated approach rather than a frenzied attack. The killer took their time, eliminating each family member without arousing the suspicion of the others, indicating either familiarity with the farm's layout or careful planning. What makes the Hinterkaifeck case particularly unsettling are the strange events that preceded the murders, suggesting the killer had been watching, perhaps even living alongside, the family before striking. In the days leading up to the murders, Andreas Gruber reported several disturbing incidents to neighbors. He discovered unfamiliar footprints in the fresh snow leading from the edge of the forest to the farm, but none leading back. This meant someone had approached the property and apparently never left. Andreas also found a strange newspaper on the farm, one that no family member had purchased. Even more alarming were the sounds. Andreas told neighbors he could hear footsteps in the attic and unexplained noises throughout the house, particularly at night.
They found footprints in the snow leading from the forest to the house, but not away from the house.
Keys went missing only to reappear in unexpected places. Small items around the farm seemed to move positions without explanation. 6 months before the murders, the previous maid had abruptly quit her position, claiming the house was haunted. She described hearing voices and footsteps when everyone was accounted for and had a persistent feeling of being watched. At the time, her concerns were dismissed as superstition. Perhaps most telling was the discovery made during the post-murder investigation. The tools in the farm's machine room showed signs of recent use, despite no family member admitting to using them. This suggested someone had been secretly accessing the property and using its resources. For days after the murders, something extraordinary happened. Or rather, didn't happen. No one reported the Gruber family missing. This wasn't due to indifference, but rather because life appeared to continue at Hinterkaifeck. Smoke rose from the chimney, cattle were fed, and chores seemed to be attended to. Unbeknownst to neighbors, the killer hadn't fled after the murders, but had instead remained on the property. It wasn't until April 4, 1922, 4 days after the murders, that people began to worry. The young Cecilia had missed several days of school, and the mail had started to pile up. A group of neighbors, including a man named Lorenz Schlittenbower, who would later become a suspect, decided to check on the family.
The whole family had missed church on Sunday. The neighbor Lorenz decided to send his sons over to the farm to investigate. They looked around and reported that there was nobody anywhere on the farm.
What they discovered defied comprehension. In the barn, partially covered by straw, lay the bodies of Andreas Gruber and his daughter Victoria. Inside the house, the neighbors found the bodies of Cecilia Gruber, Maria Baumgartner, and the 2 children. All had been brutally bludgeoned with the mattock, which was later found on the property. The crime scene revealed several disturbing details. The killer had covered some of the victims with hay and blankets, not in an apparent attempt to hide them, but almost as if providing them a form of burial. Even more unsettling, investigators determined that the chimney had indeed been in use after the murders. Someone had prepared meals in the kitchen, fed the livestock, and maintained the farm for days while the bodies of the family lay cooling nearby. The cattle had been well tended, suggesting the killer was comfortable around farm animals. Food had been eaten from the kitchen. Neighbors even reported seeing smoke from the chimney throughout the weekend, assuming it was the family going about their everyday activities. The initial investigation into the Hinterkaifeck murders was plagued by issues that would ultimately prevent the case from being solved for over a century. When police arrived from Munich, they faced challenges that seem almost unimaginable by modern standards. First, the crime scene had been severely compromised. Dozens of neighbors and curious onlookers had already trampled through the farm, touching objects, moving furniture, and even handling the bodies before authorities arrived. Critical evidence was likely destroyed in these first crucial hours. The forensic techniques available in 1922 were rudimentary at best. DNA analysis, blood spatter interpretation, and many other modern investigative tools were decades away from development. Investigators relied primarily on eyewitness accounts and physical evidence that could be observed with the naked eye. Another significant failure was the handling of the murder weapon. Though the mattock was recovered, detailed analysis was limited to basic observations about blood patterns. No fingerprint analysis was attempted, a technique that was known but not yet standardized in German police work at the time. The autopsies performed on the victims were similarly basic by today's standards. While they confirmed the cause of death as blunt force trauma, more subtle evidence that might have been gathered through modern forensic pathology was missed entirely. Perhaps most damaging to the case was the loss of crucial evidence during World War II. The victims' skulls, which had been preserved for future analysis, were lost when the Munich Medical Examiner's office was bombed during the war. This loss eliminated any possibility of using those remains for modern forensic testing. The investigation was further complicated by the rural setting and the era's communication limitations. Information traveled slowly. Witnesses were interviewed weeks or even months after the crime, and coordination between different police jurisdictions was cumbersome and inefficient. Over the decades following the murders, numerous suspects emerged, each theory seeming to address some aspects of the crime while failing to account for others. The investigation's failure to secure an arrest has left a vacuum that is still filled by speculation to this day. Among the earliest suspects was Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, who was believed to have died in World War I. Some theories propose that Gabriel had somehow survived and returned to find his wife, potentially discovering an affair. This theory gained traction when authorities were unable to locate official records confirming his death. However, the theory was eventually debunked when military documents verified that Gabriel had indeed died in 1914, dismissing him as a suspect. Another potential suspect was the farm's previous maid, who had abruptly quit 6 months prior, claiming the house was haunted. Investigators initially considered the possibility that she knew something about the murders or was involved in some way. However, her whereabouts during the time of the killings were verified, which ruled her out as a suspect. Additionally, several vagrants and transient individuals were considered, as post-war Germany had a significant population of displaced persons. Some speculated that one of these travelers might have committed the murders during a robbery gone wrong. However, this theory did not account for the strange occurrences leading up to the murders or the fact that nothing of value was stolen from the farm. This left investigators with more questions than answers as they continued to search for the true perpetrator. A traveling salesman who had previously visited farms in the area became another person of interest in the Hinterkaifeck murders case. Witnesses recalled that he had asked unusually detailed questions about the layouts of local properties, which raised suspicion. However, investigations into his whereabouts during the time of the murders could not definitively place him at Hinterkaifeck, leaving his involvement in question. As the years passed, more exotic theories began to surface. Some proposed that supernatural elements, such as ghosts or curses, could have played a role in the killings. Others suggested that the murders were politically motivated, possibly tied to post-war tensions in Germany. A few even considered the possibility that a serial killer, like Paul Mueller, mentioned in Bill James's book The Man from the Train, could have been responsible. Yet this theory lacked significant supporting evidence and failed to provide a definitive answer. As decades passed, most of the original suspects aged and died, taking any secrets they might have held with them to their graves. The possibility of bringing anyone to justice gradually diminished, and the investigation shifted from seeking prosecution to trying to understand what had happened that night in 1922. Among all the suspects, none has received more scrutiny than Lorenz Schlittenbower, a neighbor who was among the first to discover the bodies. Schlittenbower's connections to the Gruber family, his suspicious behavior at the crime scene, and his intimate knowledge of the farm's layout have made him a compelling figure in modern analyses of the case. Today, he remains a person of significant interest, with many believing that he may hold the key to solving the mystery. Schlittenbower had multiple potential motives. He had previously been in a relationship with Victoria Gabriel, and some believed he might have been the father of her youngest child, Joseph. If true, this connection could have created complex emotions, particularly if Victoria had rejected him or if there were disputes about the child. His behavior at the crime scene raised eyebrows. According to witnesses present during the discovery of the bodies, Schlittenbower separated from the group and moved through the farm with unusual familiarity, almost as if he knew what he would find. He reportedly examined the bodies closely and made comments suggesting intimate knowledge of the crime. Most suspicious was his statement about the killer's failed attempt to bury the victims due to the frozen ground. This detail wouldn't have been immediately apparent unless he had prior knowledge of the crime. This comment has been interpreted by some investigators as a slip, revealing information only the killer would know. Schlittenbower also had the physical capability to commit the murders. As a farmer himself, he would have been familiar with the mattock used in the killings and possessed the strength required to inflict the devastating blows found on the victims. Despite these suspicious elements, Schlittenbower was never charged. He had an alibi for portions of the time frame when the murders could have occurred, though not for the entire period. He remained in the area after the murders, living a seemingly everyday life, which some argue counts against his involvement. Would a guilty man remain so close to his crime? In 2007, the Hinterkaifeck case saw its most significant development in decades when students at the Polizeifachhochschule, Police Academy, in Fürstenfeldbruck, Germany, undertook a comprehensive cold case review using modern criminological techniques. This wasn't merely an academic exercise, it was a serious attempt to apply contemporary investigative methods to the historical evidence. 15 students, guided by professional instructors with backgrounds in homicide investigations, spent months meticulously reviewing all available case files, witness statements, and forensic reports. They re-interviewed surviving relatives of witnesses and examined historical records that hadn't been fully considered in the original investigation. Their approach was revolutionary for this particular case. Rather than focusing solely on who had the opportunity and means to commit the crime, the traditional approach that had failed for decades, they applied modern behavioral analysis techniques. This included creating detailed psychological profiles of both victims and potential perpetrators, analyzing victimology, and examining the specific signature elements of the crime that might reveal the killer's motivations and personality. The students applied modern forensic understanding to the limited physical evidence that remained. They analyzed blood pattern descriptions from the original reports, evaluated the positioning of bodies as documented in crime scene photographs, and considered elements like the killer's decision to remain at the farm, a behavior now recognized as significant in criminal psychology but not fully appreciated in 1922. After months of investigation, the team reached a startling conclusion. They identified a prime suspect who, they believed, was responsible for the murders. The evidence against this individual was compelling enough that, had the murders occurred in modern times with proper forensic collection, would likely have led to an arrest and prosecution. However, in a decision that has both frustrated and intrigued followers of the case, the Academy chose not to publicly name their suspect. This decision was based partly on respect for the suspect's descendants, who still lived in the region and would face inevitable public scrutiny despite having no connection to the crimes themselves. Additionally, since the suspect was long deceased and could never be brought to justice, there seemed little public benefit in naming them. What they did reveal was that their suspect was among those considered during the original investigation, but was never charged due to insufficient evidence. This statement led many to speculate that Lorenz Schlittenbower was indeed their unnamed suspect, though this was never officially confirmed by the Academy. The 2007 Police Academy study illuminated a painful truth about the Hinterkaifeck case. Much of the physical evidence that might have definitively solved the murder using modern techniques was either improperly collected in 1922 or lost in the intervening years. This reality has forced contemporary investigators to rely on documentary evidence rather than direct forensic analysis. Perhaps the most significant loss was the victims' skulls. These had been preserved after the original autopsies with the foresight that future advances might allow for better analysis. Tragically, these remains were destroyed during Allied bombing of Munich in World War II. Modern forensic anthropologists could have gleaned crucial information from these skulls. The exact angles and force of the blows might have revealed the height, strength, and potentially even handedness of the killer. Blood evidence, which today would be analyzed for DNA and pattern analysis, was inadequately documented in 1922. Descriptions exist of blood spatter on walls and floors, but the detailed photographs and measurements that would allow modern experts to reconstruct the attacks are absent. Similarly, fingerprint evidence, a technique known but not standardized in 1922, Germany was never collected adequately from the murder weapon or key surfaces in the home. The mattock itself, the murder weapon, was preserved for some time, but was not subjected to the microscopic analysis that might have revealed trace evidence like skin cells or clothing fibers from the killer. Its current whereabouts are unknown, preventing modern testing. Investigators working on the 2007 study were forced to rely primarily on written reports, witness statements, and the limited crime scene photographs that survived. They applied mathematical models to blood pattern descriptions, created computer reconstructions of the crime scene based on written measurements, and employed psychological profiling techniques that did not exist in 1922. The Hinterkaifeck murder status as an unsolved case for over a century stems from a perfect storm of circumstances that collectively prevented resolution despite multiple investigations. The era itself played a crucial role. The murders occurred at a time when forensic science was in its infancy. Blood typing had only recently been discovered, fingerprinting was not yet standardized in German police work, and concepts like DNA analysis were decades away. This timing meant that, even with the best intentions, investigators lacked the necessary scientific tools to interpret the evidence properly. Germany's turbulent 20th century history further complicated matters. The investigation began during the Weimar Republic's economic crisis, continued through the Nazi era, and was fragmented by World War II, which destroyed key evidence. Political upheavals led to changes in police personnel and methodologies, which prevented a consistent focus on the case. The rural setting created additional challenges. Hinterkaifeck's isolation meant the crimes weren't discovered for days, allowing decomposition to destroy biological evidence. The remote location also complicated the initial response, with valuable time lost as investigators traveled from Munich. Psychological factors likely played a role as well. The brutality and strange elements of the case, particularly the killer's decision to remain at the farm, were so unusual that investigators may have struggled to develop accurate profiles or identify relevant suspects. The crime did not fit the patterns they were familiar with. Most significantly, the passage of time gradually eliminated the possibility of traditional justice. As potential suspects aged and died, the focus necessarily shifted from prosecution to historical understanding. By the time modern forensic techniques were developed, most relevant suspects were deceased, physical evidence was degraded or lost, and witnesses had died. While the 2007 Police Academy study refrained from publicly naming their prime suspect, careful analysis of their findings and subsequent discussions in criminological circles has revealed certain characteristics and details about this individual that help us understand why they believe this person committed the murders. Since the 2007 study, new information has emerged, shedding light on the possible identity of the suspect in the Hinterkaifeck murders. The prime suspect was male and had a direct connection to the Gruber family, indicating that this was not a random attack by a stranger, but rather a crime committed by someone familiar with the family and the farm's layout. The suspect's knowledge of the property would have been crucial, allowing them to navigate the farm in darkness and move through the house and barn without raising an alarm. This familiarity with the farm suggests a more profound connection, possibly a person the family trusted, which made it easier for them to carry out the brutal crime without the family suspecting anything. The brutal nature of the murders points to a suspect with considerable physical strength, as the killer used a heavy mattock, a farm tool that would require significant power to wield with force and precision. Forensic reconstructions have confirmed that the blows delivered to the victims were not only violent, but executed with a level of strength that suggests the killer was no stranger to hard physical labor. Most tellingly, the lack of robbery points to a personal motive rather than a random act of violence. Despite the Gruber's wealth, no valuables were taken from the property, which suggests emotional or familial reasons drove the killings. The crime appears to have been a result of personal disputes, jealousy, or unresolved tensions within the family. The suspect's psychological profile, as reconstructed by the Academy students, paints a picture of someone capable of careful planning, yet driven by intense emotion. The premeditated nature of the crime, coupled with the excessive violence, hints at deeply rooted feelings of anger or resentment. Additionally, the killer's knowledge of rural life, including the ability to care for the animals and manage the farm after the murders, narrows the list of suspects. The ability to remain at the scene undetected, using the farm's resources, suggests someone with close ties to the Grubers, further implicating them in this chilling crime. The Hinterkaifeck murders, once a chilling enigma that haunted Germany for over a century, may have finally found their answer through modern investigative techniques. Despite the loss of crucial evidence and the passage of time, new insights into the case, including behavioral analysis and psychological profiling, have brought us closer to understanding the killer's motivations. The investigation revealed a personal, emotional motive rather than simple robbery, with the killer's familiarity with the farm and its inhabitants being a key factor. While the 2007 Police Academy study stopped short of naming the prime suspect, the details they uncovered point to Schlittenbower as the most likely perpetrator. His physical strength, connection to the family, and suspicious behavior at the crime scene have made him a focal point of many criminologists. Though justice for the victims remains unattainable, this breakthrough offers closure, reminding us that some mysteries, no matter how dark, can eventually be illuminated.